My name's Walter Bender. I'm Chief Scientific Officer at Sorcero, and I want to talk to you today about using generative AI to generate secondary manuscripts. In the context is the life sciences. So I want to go into a little bit of detail on the actual problem, explain why it's actually both a valuable problem to solve and also a difficult problem to solve. And in particular, in the life sciences, trust is paramount. So I'm going to go into a bit about how we develop a framework that's trustworthy. And then I'll show a few examples and talk about where we're heading next. So the problem we're trying to solve is really one of acceleration. We want to, right now, people create manuscripts in the life sciences all the time. In fact, there's an overwhelming number of manuscripts, and AI is being used to accelerate that generation. But the problem is twofold. One is that it still takes a really long time to go from a clinical study report to an actual manuscript. And that time is important because it's not just time equals money, but it's a cost associated with how soon we actually reach our patients, the public, with the results of a study. And then the other thing is that a lot of what's being generated isn't up to par. It's just not good enough to understand or undergo scrutiny, which is part of the scientific process. So to go into a little bit more detail on this, pharmaceutical companies and agencies that help them in the medical writing process have very lengthy turnaround times, months, not days or hours. The quality can be quite inconsistent depending on who's actually doing the writing, whether it's outsourced, who's it outsourced to. And it's also, the community of people that can do this work is pretty limited. So it's not going to scale to the needs of the community. And then finally, it's costly both, again, in terms of production costs, but also it's costly in terms of time to market. And again, the reason why time is important is because it delays patient access. So we want to reduce the time to submit a publication, reduce the time that it would take to have that publication be reviewed and get published. And then consequently, that means that the providers of healthcare can reach their patients, access their patients with the study treatment more quickly. So we really want to squeeze that time frame and get the results of the very lengthy trial to the patient as quickly as possible. So I'm going to focus today particularly on a secondary pro manuscript. It's a particular type of manuscript that's a pro is patient reported outcomes. It's a very important manuscript in the whole process of getting something, again, from the study to the patient. Secondary means that it's not the primary manuscript. It's not the manuscript that talks about the primary results of a study, but rather it's talking about some of the secondary outcomes and secondary goals of a study. And what we do is we generate a foundational draft. We're not making the final draft. We still very much depend on the authors to make the final decisions about what's the story that's being told. But we try to take a lot of the busy work out of the process in generating this foundational draft that they can operate from very, very quickly. And a couple of user stories. One of them is from the point of view of the writing team at a pharma company where they make a decision to write one of these secondary manuscripts. They gather together the materials they need, the source materials that have the data, and also very important, they have the statistical analysis plan, the protocol that was used in order to generate the study. We upload those materials, and within a few hours, we've generated a foundational draft. We review that draft, we apply a lot of different metrics to that draft, and then finally return it to the author. If we do this with an agency, then what happens is the agency really is serving as an intermediary between the pharma company's writing team and the process that Sorcero has developed in terms of generating these manuscripts. So again, it's really very much the same. It's just a matter of who's gathering the data and who's doing the polish on the output. Now, I want to talk a little bit about why this is hard. Why isn't it just a matter of I just throw things at ChatGPT and get an answer? And manuscript generation is a class of things that it actually looks quite easy, but in fact, it is quite difficult. It is quite hard. And the reason is not the Gen AI part. Asking a generative model to create text is actually quite straightforward. It's quite easy. The problem is it's got to be the right text. It's got to be validated. It's got to be based on the proper data. It's got to be meeting certain metrics and benchmarks that are industry standards. So that's not typically what will come out of a generative model. You've got to do a lot of work in order to actually get the model to do the right thing in a rigorous and repeatable and trustworthy way. So that's what I'm going to talk about throughout the rest of my talk, is how we actually achieve this. So a couple of more details on why it's hard. There are a variety of different skill sets involved, and the model is going to need to know about these different skill sets. So you need to have somebody who actually understands the structure of clinical trials. You need to understand the basics of the statistical analysis plan. You need to understand the various guidelines that industry requires of these types of manuscripts. There are a lot of little subtleties in generating the output. So for example, you can't do p-value mining when you're generating a manuscript. Everything has got to be a hypothesis that was defined within the actual clinical trial and the clinical study plan. It can't be things sort of ad hoc after the fact or post hoc. And you need to also control for hallucinations and bias. That's a real problem. We can't have promotional language. This is going to be a scientific manuscript. And we also have to make sure that we're reflecting the author's intent and emphasis above all, because we can generate things, but the authors actually have a story to tell, and we want to make sure that we're reflecting that story. There are a lot of different ways of spinning the same data, the same outcomes, but we want to make sure that we're telling the story the authors really are subscribing to. And then finally, it's got to be trustworthy. And to be trustworthy, we really need to make sure that we're repeatable and that we're rigorous and again, in a scientific sense. And so I want to use an analogy, and I'm going to actually warn you later on about the pitfalls of analogies. But you can think of writing one of these manuscripts as performing a surgery. And in a surgery, what you do with the scalpel in the OR is really just one part of the process. There's all the pre-surgical prep, diagnoses and preparation, and then there's lots of post-surgical work that is done in terms of monitoring the success of the operation. So just as surgery is not just the surgery itself, generating one of these manuscripts is not just Gen AI. It's lots of data prep, and it's lots of post-op examination and application of metrics and tests. But trust again is a real issue. It's become more and more of an issue as AI is playing a bigger and bigger role in literature and publications, and we're getting the industry itself is overwhelmed by volume, and unfortunately, there's a lot of that's actually either fictitious or full of hallucinations, just not sufficiently accurate, and it's quite misleading. And there's been a lot of retraction of late. So we really want to make sure that what we're producing, again, is trustworthy and can be repeated. Some of the types of things that happen, there's lots of predictive and statistical biases that come into play. Hallucinations, I think everyone's familiar with. I mentioned analogies earlier, and it's fine to use an analogy when you're giving a talk like this, But in a scientific publication, analogies can be quite misleading. So you really have to avoid them. And that's actually one of the things that AI systems love to do. These generative AI systems love to make analogies, and they're just not appropriate in this context. And then there are also persistent hallucinations. One example from some earlier work of mine, I was generating some text about a breast cancer study, and the model insisted that it was women in breast cancer, even though, in fact, men can have breast cancer too. And I couldn't shake it from that persistent bias because it just statistically was so overwhelming in terms of the data that the model was trained on. So there are lots of different things you've got to be looking out for. So, so building trust is really a lot of what my focus has been on. And so we need to make sure that everything can be scrutinized in the manner in which scientific research and the life sciences scrutinizes its own work. So we can't have a generative model that's not being scrutinized the same way everything else is being scrutinized. Otherwise, essentially, you've thrown out all the trust in the entire system. So to build trust, you need to be able to reproduce consistent results. Everything has to be traceable back to source. You need to have audit trails. Everything's got to be transparent and explainable. And then finally, you've got to apply industry benchmarks. In the life sciences, there are very specific benchmarks like Consort that define what has to be in a publication, what has to be in a manuscript. And you can't ignore those. You've actually got to make sure that you're adhering to those benchmarks. And again, being a system that can reproduce over and over and over again a process is really important to actually making this thing be useful in the field. It can't just be a one-off. So you need to constantly be testing models as models change to make sure that things come back the way you expect. You need to have some standardized data sets you can use for benchmarking. And again, the audit trails has to be there forever. And another thing that's really important when you're doing this work is to make sure that every single assertion that's made in the manuscript can be traced back to a particular insight in the source material or a particular fact asserted in the source material. So you can't be generating things that aren't actually backed by the data. And so you need to make that data traceable from the final manuscript. And finally, every single thing is audited just the way we audit everything that happens in a clinical trial. It has to be independent, that audit. And so again, that's more bookkeeping than anything else, but it's something that's often overlooked in the casual approach to this problem. And finally, black boxes are really, they're verboten. You need to be able to make sure that there's a rationale for everything that's done. And you can go back and see the justification for the decisions that were made. And a lot of times those justifications come from the industry guidelines. So in a pro manuscript, there's, for example, an extension to the consort that defines what's supposed to be in a pro document. That's one of the justifications for particular passages in the text that you might be finding. So we have to make sure that we have the proper industry standards associated with every decision that's being made. So the workflow has to, from the very beginning, from when we get the data in to when we've actually generated this manuscript that has insights and discussion and assertions, it all has to be packaged together, and it can't be sort of scotch tape and rubber bands. It's really got to be thorough and again, repeatable, traceable, auditable. These are some of the benchmarks that we use when we're doing pro work. There are other benchmarks for other manuscript types. I'll leave it as an exercise for the person watching this talk to investigate some of these, but they're all well documented. One of the things that's been interesting for me of late is the Consort guidelines just had an update. The previous Consort guidelines were last updated in 2010. In 2025, just a couple of months ago, they came out with a new set of guidelines, and so we need to incorporate that new set of guidelines in the process. And then finally, the metrics that we apply are, first of all, making sure that everything is accurate in terms of the science and in terms of the data, making sure we're adhering to all the rules, making sure we're complete and comprehensive in terms of what's expected to be in one of these manuscripts. We need to make sure that the language is proper and professional. There's no promotional language, consistency in our terminology. And then finally, we want to make sure that we're really getting that message of the author aligned and consistent throughout. The EMA and actually a lot of other organizations are really insistent that AI should assist, not replace human expertise. And there are actually a lot of restrictions in terms of what you're allowed to generate using AI in scientific literature. And in particular, you're not allowed to generate figures. And our process is very much a human plus AI is better than human or AI. We try to facilitate the human expertise working with the AI output. And again, we have at the end of the generative process, we have a subject matter expert do a final validation to make sure that everything is aligned and proper. And again, a lot of the work goes into making sure that that expert can spend their time wisely and efficiently. So we put a lot of effort into providing hooks that are going to make that easy. Just, that's what we're doing. Does it work? Again, we use a process, something like this. We ingest the protocols. If there's a primary manuscript, we use that. The statistical analysis plan, the data from the study, which is something called a table figure listing document, and any kickoff notes that might give us some insight into what the author's intentions are. We generate the manuscript, and then we go through validation. We apply our benchmarks, and finally our SME review. This is an example of one of the manuscripts that we've generated, and you can see that it's a complete manuscript, title, abstract, tables, figures, and the like, and it's adhering to the various guidelines. We apply our metrics, and you can see this manuscript did quite well. And we also, in the process of applying the metrics, come up with recommendations about how we might improve the manuscript. And if the metric wasn't satisfied, if we didn't reach threshold, then we can go back, take these recommendations, feed them back in, and improve the manuscript. So in terms of what's next, we are doing a lot of different things. We need to continuously look at the models and monitor them, monitor their performance. We've got to make sure that everything that's coming out of the system is clear and transparent. The regulatory environment for this work is constantly changing, so we need to stay on top of that. Our stakeholders have different needs and different frameworks in which they operate, so we need to be able to adopt to that. And finally, we need to make sure that we're considering the ethical aspects of this, that the AI is transparent, we maintain human oversight, and we are on top of any bias that might be introduced by the AI. So in general, where the industry's heading is trying to come up with a standard for how AI is applied. And we think that a lot of the work we're doing in this process is ripe for the picking for developing that standard. We've really been meticulous in terms of looking at the guidelines in industry and making sure that we've got very clear and transparent metrics we apply after the fact. And with that, I say thank you and happy to take some questions.